You don't even live in our neighborhood, but you will follow our rules. That was the first sentence I heard from the woman now known in my mind. And later in several Facebook threads, as HOA Karen, she stood on my gravel driveway, like she owned it, clutching a thick manila envelope in one hand and a coffee mug in the other. The mug, fittingly, read Queen of Everything. I remember that clearly, because she pointed at my newly built pole barn with the mug like it was some kind of scepter. I live on the edge of a small rural town, far from the cookie-cutter suburbs and overly landscaped cul-de-sacs that people, like Karen, tend to rule over with a clipboard and a vengeance. My property is 5 acres of peace and pine trees, legally and geographically outside the reach of any HOA. Across the street, however, sits the Whispering Oaks subdivision, a pristine, rule-heavy neighborhood of beige homes, matching mailboxes, and neighbors who report each other for leaving their trash cans out 15 minutes past pickup. For a while, we coexisted quietly. I kept to myself, and they ignored me. But that changed the moment I decided to build a pole barn. It wasn't fancy, just a tall, practical metal structure for my tools, tractor, and a couple of classic motorcycles I'd been meaning to restore. The county had approved the plans. I got all the permits. I paid the fees. I followed every regulation that applied to me. What I didn't do, apparently, was consider the visual harmony of the HOA community across the street. That's what Karen told me after marching across the road uninvited. She said that several residents had complained that my building was an eyesore, visible from their walking trail. I looked behind her, across the road, through a line of tall pine trees. You'd have to go out of your way, practically into the ditch, to even see the corner of my barn. But to her, that corner was enough to violate what she called the community aesthetic. I tried explaining. Calmly, I told her that I wasn't part of their neighborhood, that my land was outside the HOA's jurisdiction, that their rules didn't apply to me. Her answer, "You're next to us, and that makes you part of the visual community. You need to submit your construction through the architectural committee." I laughed. I honestly thought she was joking. She wasn't. A week later, a certified letter arrived at my door. It was an official-looking document from Whispering Oaks HOA, signed by their president, Karen herself. It claimed that I had constructed an unauthorized structure that violates community guidelines, and that I was now subject to legal action unless I dismantled the building or agreed to repaint it to match the approved palette. I ignored it politely. I even sent a letter back, stating clearly that my property was not within the bounds of their HOA, citing the parcel numbers, the legal property description, and the lack of any HOA lien or covenant in my deed. 2 weeks later, I was served. Karen had filed a civil lawsuit on behalf of the HOA, claiming that my barn created a nuisance to the neighborhood. Her legal theory? That although I wasn't within the subdivision, my property was adjacent to it, and thus my non-compliance affected their home values and peace of mind. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I am someone who's dealt with enough property disputes to know how to read county GIS maps, property lines, and legal charters. I pulled up the HOA's founding documents from the county registry. Their map, their bylaws, their jurisdiction, everything clearly ended at the edge of their final lot, which was separated from me by a county-maintained road. That road, according to county zoning, was the hard boundary, everything beyond it including. My land was designated agricultural residential and not subject to any HOA. Karen hadn't just overreached. She'd walked into court with a bag full of emotional arguments and neighborhood gossip, thinking that was enough to make a legal claim. But I wasn't planning to roll over. I hired a real estate attorney, one who'd dealt with HOA overreach before, and handed him everything: my title, my deed, my permits, and most importantly, the HOA's own charter showing I was entirely outside of their scope. The day of the hearing arrived. Small courtroom, quiet crowd. Karen came dressed like she was attending a state funeral: black blazer, pearls, and the same superiority she wore on her face every time she spoke. Her stack of evidence, photos taken from behind some shrubs and blurry shots of my barn taken at weird angles to make it look more intrusive. She even had a letter from one of her neighbors saying the barn gave off an industrial vibe. That ruined their evening walks when the judge entered. The tension was thick. Karen stood and launched into her statement, citing community standards, neighborhood cohesion, and something about visual contamination. She spoke like she was defending all of suburbia from a villain who dared to build something functional instead of ornamental. Then my lawyer stood, walked up with a single printed page, and said, "Your Honor, we'd like to submit this map from the county assessor's office, clearly showing that my client's land is not within the HOA jurisdiction. Furthermore, here's the HOA's own boundary map confirming the same. There's no legal authority here." The judge didn't even look confused. He looked *annoyed*. He flipped through the documents, checked the parcel numbers, and said, almost immediately, "Ms. Hutchins, your HOA's authority does not extend beyond its mapped boundary. This man's land is not under your control, and this case has no standing in this court. Dismissed." 3 minutes, that's all it took. Karen didn't speak. She just stood there frozen, mouth slightly open, as the judge moved on to the next case. I gathered my papers, nodded politely, and walked out. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. I walked out of that courtroom with a quiet satisfaction, but I knew the storm wasn't over. Karen was the kind of person who didn't take embarrassment lightly, especially public humiliation in front of a judge. As I stepped into the parking lot, I glanced back and saw her still standing at the courthouse entrance, arguing with someone on the phone, probably a board member, probably trying to spin the story in her favor. But here's the thing about HOA Karens like her. They don't just stop when they lose. They regroup. They look for loopholes. They try to twist the story until somehow they're still the victims. So I decided not to wait for her next move. I made mine first. I started digging through the HOA's financial disclosures, which, by law, had to be made public to all neighborhood residents. I wasn't a member, of course, but a few Whispering Oaks homeowners had already messaged me, apologizing for Karen's behavior and sharing their own grievances. One of them, an older gentleman named Frank, was on the verge of selling his house because, in his words, Karen's turned the place into a dictatorship. He gladly handed me copies of the last 3 years of meeting minutes, budgets, and notices. What I found was gold. Karen had filed that lawsuit against me not as a private citizen, but as the acting president of the HOA, using community funds *. She'd never held a vote on it, never informed the board, and never gave the residents any official notice. She dipped directly into the legal expense fund intended for neighborhood disputes, not petty vendettas, and hired a lawyer without going through any proper procedure. That's a big deal in HOA land. Huge, actually. Because when you're handling other people's money, especially in a legal capacity, you have to follow the rules to the letter. Otherwise, you're not just being irresponsible, you're breaking the law. So I made a few anonymous calls, one to the county clerk's office, another to the state's HOA compliance division, and just to be sure, one more to a local news tip line. I didn't want headlines. I just wanted attention in the right places. 3 weeks later, the state sent an official inquiry to the Whispering Oaks board. Karen was still listed as the president at that time, but by then, several members had begun to question her leadership. A special meeting was called. I wasn't invited, obviously, but I didn't need to be. The results spoke for themselves. Within a month, the HOA board released a notice to all residents that an internal audit had found serious procedural violations regarding recent legal expenditures. Karen was removed as president, and the board itself was temporarily dissolved pending further state review. A management firm was brought in to oversee operations, but the damage had already been done. Residents were furious. My barn, which they barely noticed at first, suddenly became a symbol of resistance, proof that someone finally stood up to the nonsense. One by one, people started pushing back. They began attending meetings. They voted down Karen's proposed restrictions on outdoor furniture colors. They refused her request to ban garden gnomes and wind chimes. It was like the entire neighborhood had been under a spell, and now that it was broken, no one wanted to go back. I found all of this out through Frank and a few others who started dropping by my place now and Then, usually with coffee or baked goods, eager to share the latest updates. One of them, a retired teacher named Marcia, brought over a copy of the HOA's revised charter. She laughed as she handed it to me and said, "We added a clause that makes it illegal to file legal action against non-members." You made history, to be honest. I didn't care much about making history. I just wanted to be left alone to build my barn and live in peace. But it felt good knowing I'd helped shut down something so arrogant, so unjust, and frankly, so absurd. And Karen, oh, she didn't disappear quietly. She tried to run for the board again under a different name, literally wrote her name as K. Hutchins on the ballot like people wouldn't recognize her. That got shut down fast. Then she tried to form a neighborhood committee to act as an unofficial HOA. The county quickly informed her that no such authority could exist without legal backing, and that she was already under investigation for misusing community funds. Eventually, her house went up for sale. No open house, no goodbyes. Just a moving truck one morning and a for sale by owner sign leaning crooked against her mailbox. She left as quietly as someone like her could, probably fuming all the way to her next victim. After she was gone, the neighborhood changed. People relaxed. You could hear music playing on porches again. Kids started riding bikes without being told to slow down for property values. One family even set up a small community garden in their front yard, something that would have caused Karen to file a formal complaint 2 months earlier. As for me, I decided to have a little fun. For 1 week, I painted the front of my barn neon green, just the front, just the side facing the walking trail, and just long enough for a few HOA members to snap pictures and laugh. Then I painted it back to a respectable forest gray, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Peace returned to my little patch of land. No more surprise visits, no more threats, no more envelopes from self-appointed rulers, just quiet evenings, my barn, and the satisfying knowledge that a clipboard and a bad attitude aren't enough to scare off someone who actually knows their rights. The irony. Karen probably thought she was protecting her community by suing me, but in the end, her arrogance woke them up, and they realized that a community doesn't need rulers, it needs neighbors. So next time someone tells you that you have to follow rules that don't apply to you, don't just roll over. Know your boundaries, know your rights, and if someone like Karen comes knocking with a stack of threats, make sure you're ready, because sometimes all it takes is one person standing firm and the whole house of cards comes crashing down.